Hey YouTube, Nate with Cam Power Sports here, and
My name is Hurst. I'm also with Cam Power Sports.
what we have today is we're going to do a video series on this particular engine right here that I'm leaning on. In all honesty, I've broken it down already, and we decided to put it back together because of some key things that were going on. This is a street race engine we built 4 or 5 years ago. It's a stock stroke engine and has been run through the ringer pretty heavily for quite a few years. So I decided it's going to become a stock cylinder 7mm sleeper. And I've decided that we're going to make a series of videos on this particular engine, going through a regular teardown, inspecting what wear and tear is there and what has happened over the course of its life. And since I built this, I kind of know how it was versus what we're seeing. So I slapped it back together, and we're just kind of make the series, breaking the engine down. We're going to go through the full build process. I don't know how many videos it'll be. We'll try to stay, on point and keep things short and sweet but clear. But long story short, this is going to be a series of videos of the teardown, the cleaning, the assembly, and the conversion to a 7mm stock cylinder. So with all that said, we'll get started with the teardown. Alright, so where we're going to start first of all is go ahead and remove the flywheel and get into the clutch side. And we're going to go through a few things here. Again, this engine's been run through the ringer. It's ran its paces. It owes the owner nothing. It's had a good life. So we'll move forward, and we're going to start by removing the flywheel. The sprocket's already off, and we'll go from there, and we're just going to check things as we go. Never use a 3-jaw puller on these flywheels. This is an OEM puller. They're cheap. 3-jaw pullers, any other form of pullers, either bends the dish right here, breaks the magnets. No hammers. The magnets around the flywheel can get broken, and you can't see them easily because they're covered with stainless, and they'll create a problem. The threads here are left-hand threads. So you insert the puller in. Make sure they're very, very fine threads, so make sure that you have a good bite in the flywheel. These threads get rusty, they get a little bit hammered, it gets tricky when damage is in this hub area of the flywheel. But unless you're wanting to replace your flywheel, never 3-jaw pullers. Heat will ruin these. Heat will weaken the magnets, and you'll lose stator signal. You can eat CDIs, you can go through stators, and those types of problems. So you thread your puller in, run the nut in. Some of them are hard. A little bit of grease in there will help. It forces hydraulics, but never hammer on a stator. Now, I don't know if Hurst can focus in on me. You can see through this stainless play exactly what's been going on with this flywheel. There is a little bit of minor marking here. I know it's had a 3-jaw puller on in its past. I didn't check run out. This dish could be bent, but we're rubbing the stator, and I'll get videos of what's going on with the stator in a minute. You can actually see, because of the rubbing, the magnet sections through the ring. And I'll hold still for a second, see if we can zoom in on that and see if Hurst can find that. I know this flywheel's been wobbling on the crank. There wasn't damage to the crankshaft snout. The timing keyway was in position. The crank was installed where it was supposed to be. However, it was wobbling pretty bad, and I'll get to the stator in a minute. It literally was touching the timing plate, and the triggers have broken the pickup coil. So the rivets, I don't know if the camera can pick that up. It sounds like sand in them. These rivets that hold these hubs on, clearly there's hammer marks. It's been banged on. you know, I can see some of the problem with the dish right here. This flywheel is done. Whether or not it still ran, it's not going to go back in the engine. So it's run out. It may be wobbling on the hub. The rivets are loose on the hub. It's able to wobble on its own hub, even though it's hard to physically see it or make it do it. The rivets have been banged on with the hammer. We question the integrity of the magnets. Are they cracked underneath this stainless cover or not? This flywheel has served its life and is good for the trophy cabinet and nothing more. On the stator, Hurst, you'll probably have to come zoom in a little bit. You can see the plastic sheathing up here. Your old motor. Plastic sheathing up here has been completely, the isolation sheathing has been completely rubbed off on several of these towers. On the pickup coil here, that's where it crashed into the pickup coil and busted it open. The bike still ran. You know, in this condition, the bike still ran. It wasn't like a failed stator, wasn't like a failed part, but it's definitely, these are some of the indicators you look for on your teardown, what's going on. You know, the taper of the flywheel is pretty good. We know that the stator didn't come off, that the flywheel didn't come off. And when I pull the stator, I'll show you the wear ring back under here where the flywheel literally was able to hit the stator plate. Okay, we'll move forward and pull that stator. Okay, work the grommet out of the back of the case. Sometimes they fit a little bit tight in their grooves. These timing plates are a little bit different. Feed your wire back through the case. Bring your black and your yellow out with the harness first, and there'll be enough room for the plug to clear. Like that. Okay. Right here by the pickup trigger. Let's zoom in on that, see if you can get that. Right here. Right through there. That's where it rubbed the raise areas. So this flywheel was wobbling so bad, and you can see it in the fronts of these towers too. They're supposed to be plastic coated to keep those coils isolated from the stator bars. Anyway, so it's clear the flywheel was wobbling, and again the crank snout, normal wear, keyway isn't all chewed up. It's clear the flywheel didn't come off. The keyway's in factory condition. Threads look great. Snout's not bent. Nobody's hit the end with a hammer. That's another thing you want to look for. These cranks oftentimes are bent right here from over torquing the nut or being hit with a hammer, especially on your dirt bikes where you have to split the cases and they're press fit crankshafts. They get banged a lot to knock them out of the cases. Some more of the things that you look for. So that's pretty much on the flywheel side. That's what we saw. You know, the flywheel led to a whole host of problems. There's a lot of banging around on the stator. The flywheel itself has seen some issues. It's not running out true. It's clear without even checking it, just by looking at what's going on. And those are the kinds of things that you look for during your disassembly. That's pretty much on this side. You want to check your output shaft, check it for up and down. Your seal boss, they get lots of deep rings in them. This one's pretty dirty around the chain. I don't feel a whole lot of tension in that seal, but we're pretty dry around the seal area, so even though it could use a new seal, I don't believe that it was leaking. The O-rings in the neutral cover, those shrink. They're not a super tight fit. They're just a snug fit. These always split around the screw heads. This one is not. We make a billet aluminum one that rectifies that problem and really tightens up the O-ring to the case. There could be some sweating from there, and it simply could be from his maintenance, oiling the chain. But we're extra crummy around here. This little dowel pin and this little dowel pin, those are plug caps that's pressed into the case, tapped in. Behind those are your shift forks. If the C-clip pops off of your shift fork that retains it in place, they can come out and literally push these plugs out of the case. and it's often overlooked or missed. There's 2 of them for each shift shaft, and you want to look and make sure those are there. I've seen a lot of Banshees get this seal changed, and people fight it thinking that they can't solve an oil leak when that plug is missing and the oil's just coming straight out the bore. And the rod's in there, so it's not a huge hole because the rod displaces it, but it's a good size leak. So something to look at on your disassembly. Make sure you have those shift shaft plugs. We'll go ahead and pull out the neutral door. We're done with this side, so we'll come back in just a minute and we'll pull the cylinder head. Okay. Now, before I get into the head, I turned the engine around and it reminded me of one thing I wanted to talk about. Some of you guys ship your motors out to builders. You know, we receive them all the time in the mail. We send them all over the world. This exhaust right here is the result of packaging. You want to pack these things tight. They're going to fall off conveyors. They're going to be kicked around. Guys are going to throw them. Expect the worst when you box this, and you'll have a successful. I have never, in the 9 years I've been in business, doing this mail order for 9 years, I've never had an engine leave here and be broken. This engine got broken in transit here. Who knows why, and whether it fell off a conveyor, whether it got stabbed with a forklift, who knows. But anyway, tight packing, you know. I've received engines in Pelican cases. That has been the nicest shipping that I've received. They're expensive. They're a couple $100. I've looked at them online. It's worth the investment. You know, this right here paid for a Pelican case if this cylinder was going to be reused. You know, I would have to weld this up, blend it, do a lot of work, fix my old porting that was in here just to bring the cylinder back around over shipping. Boxes, double boxes with void between the 2 sizes of boxes. Lots of rags. No popcorn, no air bubbles, no Walmart bubbles, no pillow packs. They just pop, and then your engine's left to flop around the box. Engine in a good heavy duty box, usually 18 by 18. Real tight packing. Rags, towels, you know, thrift store clothing, whatever. It adds to the weight, but you want this thing packed. Pillows, $4 Walmart pillows, small investment. Something that isn't going to pop. Bulge that box a little bit, the first box. Stuff this engine in there tight. Make sure you're underneath it too. I've received many engines with the drain plug knocked through the bottom of the case, but the sides were packed pretty good. So, you know, enough of that. Inside the 18 by 18 box, a 24 by 24 box creates the void. Newspaper, butcher paper, packaging paper, more paper style. Box in a box, tight with rags. Your engine will make it safely. Alright, enough about packing. On with removing the head. This particular engine had some issues with a crankshaft bearing, and it led to detonation in the other cylinder as one cylinder was failing. So we have a few things we get to look at in one engine. A detonation style damage, a needle bearing failure style damage that passed shrapnel to up above. So we'll pull the head here. Thanks, sirs.
No problem.
I let one get out of my hand. Okay. Now, we're going to be missing some O-rings on this one because I've already had it off. Make sure and don't drop your domes on the cement or you'll be buying another one. Okay, so before we get into the cylinder, here you've got a bunch of carnage that's happened to the dome. Sometimes a ring failure and a ring breaks up and you'll literally plant pieces of piston ring into the dome. The styles of these dents are all pin punches, and there's a little bit of steel deposited right here. So clearly this dome ate something. This dome looks just fine. A little bit of castor or bean oil, you know, instead of good clean synthetics, but it looks fine. You know, nothing's really going on with it. Okay, so that kind of right off the bat, you know you're going to be looking for a ring or a needle bearing failure at the crankshaft, whether it's wrist pin or the big end pin. Sometimes you can literally see pieces of the shrapnel back and you can discern exactly where it came from. In this case, we have a little bit of deposits, but a lot of pocks and pits. So it ate something, but we don't know what yet. So now we know where to put our focus and our attention as we move forward with this. So here's culprit number one, or piston number one. Same story as the dome. A lot of pocks, most of it's trapped in the squish band areas, some scratches. The overall burn pattern on the piston was pretty good, so you know, you can rule out a lean related issue. This one, I would presume, has a needle bearing issue in the big end, but based on what I'm seeing, I can't rule out that it didn't just have a ring hook and a ring failure as we go down. So because of the load, you can see some melting at the exhaust port, and of course you got the crown hot enough to what we call plasticize, and it literally, as I nickname it, hold a piston. This is a temperature failure. The piston's caving in. This was molten aluminum at one time. It was breaking away. If this were straight detonation or an extreme lean situation, you would not see this crater, most likely. It's not set in stone. But you have two things going on here with this piston. One is, and I'll show it better with the cylinder off, this timing edge of the piston has eroded away because the heat concentrates at the exhaust port in the cylinder, and it's the hotter zone. While this side of the piston looks great still. And then you have your erosion and finally your cave-in and blow-through in the center of the piston. The failure of this piston is a heat-related issue in an otherwise normal, jetted normal engine, and the reason it failed is because of the extra duty put on it by this mechanical failure that dragged the neighboring bore down and took the cylinder temperatures past their threshold. Remember, this engine was raced and ran hard for 5 years, so you know, this is kind of the catastrophe. This particular cylinder in this particular case was an effect, not a cause. It was the other cylinder that led to the destruction of this cylinder. So, you know, that kind of paints the picture of what's going on, and that's part of the reason I chose this engine. We had problems at the flywheel, yet it ran. We had two different style failures in the same engine, so it was a good indicator. It was something that I could base off of, and it was good because detonation can look like this, and you can make a piston look like this in 5 minutes on a brand new engine, but it wasn't the case here. It was ran for several years, and then all of a sudden, you know, a lean style or detonation style failure looked like it showed up, but the reality of the matter was it was the other cylinder failing that led to the demise of the mag side here. So we'll go ahead and move forward and pull the cylinders. Okay, let's go ahead and have a look here. We're going to be looking at the bores a little bit too. These are ported. It even welded some aluminum to the top of the bore here. I don't know how well the camera's going to show, if we can get it to focus. There we go. Okay, so you can see the welded aluminum right there. The timing edge of the exhaust port's still pretty good. There wasn't really a whole lot going on in the barrel that was abnormal considering the duty of this motor. This was a drag motor. It was wrung out hard every time it was ridden. Okay, so we kind of see some normal stuff going on with the cylinder. Very savable had the exhaust port not been broken in shipping. Same with the piston. You have all your the ring is literally trapped. It wiped the aluminum right over it. Trapped both rings in there. You still have machining right here. This piston was totally happy until its duty cycle was taken out. The crown of this piston was overheated. The skirt doesn't show a lot. A little bit of four corner seizing going on here. That's this part and this part. It could use a little bit better warm-up cycles, but that wasn't the problem with this piston. And same with the intake side, which you're not going to be able to see in the camera. But the machining rings are still in this skirt. Had it not been exposed to extreme crown temperatures, this piston and cylinder would have been just fine. Okay, so that's kind of what we saw going on with the cylinders, and we can do the same thing with the other cylinder. I've already removed the rings, looking for the broken ring. We didn't trap a lot of shrapnel in the bore. That's why I believe we passed a needle bearing up. Usually when rings let go, these ring lands are pretty hamburgered. You have pieces of trapped ring all over the place as they come out and wedge. Same story. Machining ring still on the piston. Whatever mechanical failure led up to the demise of this cylinder, whether it was a hooked ring, a failed ring, or a needle bearing from below, prior to that mechanical failure, these two cylinders were very happy. They're still as machined after 5 years. So had the mechanical failure not happened to this cylinder, this top end still would have been fine. The crank, come in here. The crank has walked because of the flywheel. I don't know if you can see that gap right there. It's supposed to be 28 thousandths. I could put a feeler gauge in right here and measure that gap. You're not focused very good. Let's see if we can work with that. There you go. So he's got the camera at an angle, but I've got better than 100 thousandths. I'm 4 times the width that I should be by spec right here. We know that flywheel wobbling was starting to separate this crank and walk it apart at the pins. That could be part of what led to the problem, the extra wobbling. I haven't had the crank out of the case yet. I don't know that we're missing a needle bearing. The wrist pin bearings are fine. But long story short, the flywheel and the damage we saw on the flywheel side did translate through the bearing and did start to show its true colors here. A lot of old time builders nickname it flopping elephant ears. These two webs are pressed on this pin. These two portions of your crankshaft are pressed on this pin, and if you're out of balance or out of true, and even in normal engines, they can get to wobbling pretty badly, and that's why they nickname it elephant ears. And what ends up happening is if that frequency is low enough of that wobbling, it will literally begin to climb off this pin and the cranks separate, and that's what goes on. Oftentimes you'll see main bearing failures where the main bearing would normally be good. But anyway, so enough about that. The flywheel definitely played through and affected the crank. I'm going to move forward and go ahead and remove the pistons, and then we'll come back and we'll be into the clutch side to see what's going on there. Okay, one thing I forgot to mention before we jump into the clutch cover, I just forgot to bring it up. If you look at the color of this rod, you can see that it's been heat fatigued. It's a much darker color. This particular brand comes with a copper plating as part of the hardening process. You can see the color difference right off the bat, so you know you've got some heat fatigue to this rod regardless of fit specification. Your rocking like this is within spec on both rods. They're very similar. I believe that is a very, very crude way to decide the health of the needle bearing down below. You should never be able to, and it's hard to not twist and rock, you should never be able to pull up and down, and you need to try and check that at a couple different positions of the crank's rotation so that you're feeling all the way around the pin. Again, it's crude, but at least you'll know if you have an oval pin or a wear spot in your pin. Oftentimes one side of the pin will be brand new still, while the work side has a step worn into it. So you need to take that into consideration, and don't just feel it one spot, but absolutely no up and down play. The side to side play, I treat it as a grain of salt. I I don't feel like it's a very good way of checking the health of the bearing. You can't see them very well, and it is judgment calls unless you're going to break the crank down and do it correctly and visually inspect and measure everything and check fit that way. But I just wanted to point out the rod coloring. It was clear that the top of that piston had issues. The other indicator that the piston was plasticized was the wrist pin bearing was extremely difficult to get out the first time because the piston had warped, and as soon as I released it from one half, then it came out much easier the rest of the way. So the piston had warped, and the bosses had put a bind on the pin. Okay, now we'll move to the clutch side.